Very good evening to all of you and a warm welcome back to another session in the series of Meeting an Expert. As Asia Pacific Institute of Information Technology, known as APIT Sri Lanka, we are honored to host this session today with another industry expert, and a warm welcome to all our students in the platform and all our partner university delegates who are joining us today. And then, of course, all the foreign delegates and diplomats who are joining us today from different parts of the world, along with all the distinguished guests. So to start with our webinar for the day, we have our chairman of APIT Sri Lanka, Mr. Bandula Egodage, to share his expressions along with a welcome. Chairman, over to you.
Thank you, Kaushali and Dr. Rohanta. In fact, indeed, this is another very good initiative for APIT, directed by Dr. Rohanta. So, Amena, on behalf of our CEO, Mr. Roshan Egodage, and Board of Directors, whole student population, and also the staff, and the viewers, I would like to welcome you very warmly and to express my gratitude and thank for being with us this important moment. It's a great pleasure and it's a great honor to have you here. In fact, just to express from our side, what is the objective of this meeting is created by Dr. Rohanta. Basically, we are 100% sure about our students' education, but more than that, we are giving an opportunity for our students and also as the viewers to have the direct link with people like you all, person like you all, the opinion leaders, to have a direct intervention and interaction for them to update their knowledge and also to have some sort of a practical approach in their life. So APIT believes in the academic excellence. On top of that, APIT wants to build future leaders. So leadership means it's not only the to get the certain title. Leadership means for you are giving something back to the society when you are going out. So it's the fulfillment of any human being. This is what we believe from APIT. So Amena, you are there, and it's a great thing that you are joining from probably from Nairobi. So you are spending your time for the very valued CSR sort of a thing, because today you are giving something to the world, so something to our future generation. So without further doing, I would like to hand over this great session for Dr. Rohanta. And I must say once again, it's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for your important times that you are spending with us. Thanks, Amena. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And let me introduce one of the greatest people I have met in IFC, who has done a lot for Sri Lanka in different spheres, not only professionally, but driving women empowerment. And she's the country manager for Kenya cluster for IFC, and based in Nairobi, covering Burundi, Malawi, Rwanda, Somalia, Tanzania, and Uganda. Amena has had various careers in banking before joining IFC in 2012 in Pakistan. As a banker working in international banks such as Citibank, NA, ABN AMRO, she worked across industries and markets. This experience held her in good stead when she joined IFC as part of the financial institutions group covering the MENA region. Her role there encompasses both investment and advisory services. She has worked in challenging, fragile, and post-conflict markets and was recently IFC's country manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives. She has moved to Kenya cluster of countries based out of Nairobi in early 2021 as the country manager. Amena, it's actually lovely to see you and hear you again. Over to you, who will talk about your experience in Sri Lanka. Amena, over to you.
Thank you so much to both of you for the rather I think, overly generous introduction. Thank you very much. I'm not sure I deserve that fulsome an introduction, but Very happy to be here. Absolutely delighted to have anything that relates back to our home country of Sri Lanka. We lived there for 5 years, my children and I. As I said, as Rohanta mentioned, we just moved earlier this year to Nairobi. In fact, with my children, I just arrived in Nairobi yesterday. Before that, I was alone, just doing my paperwork and that, and went back to Pakistan, picked them up. So really, really weird. I think since my children arrived yesterday, all they've been talking about is Colombo and home, which is for them Colombo. So delighted to be here. Now, I was a bit thrown when Rohanta asked me a couple of times to join, and I'm afraid I was a bit difficult to catch because of the transition and my move. But, he asked me to speak about my experience in Sri Lanka, and that really got me thinking as to the time when I first arrived there and how that kind of went. So I'm Pakistani. Let me introduce myself a little bit to you. I'm from Pakistan. I lived and worked in Pakistan for most of my career. I worked for multinational banks, but I was covering Pakistan and for a time Afghanistan for these banks. And Afghanistan for the international banks was a non-presence country. I was lucky enough to be, sort of part of the management looking at Afghanistan. Lucky, I guess, when the Afghan war hit. So suddenly the country went through a very, very big change almost overnight. And I was part of that. So that was, again, quite a big learning experience. So when I joined IFC, I was part of the Middle East North Africa team, which for IFC meant Pakistan, Afghanistan, and, North Africa. And then the Middle East. Middle East, we're not really that active, but, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, all the way through to Morocco, Egypt, and so on and so forth. So that was the region I was part of. And I was looking at the financial institutions group. That's what I was, that was my industry group. I moved to Sri Lanka, and honestly, when I was moving, my whole thing was, well, I'm South Asian. I've lived in South Asia my entire life. There is, Sri Lanka will be very South Asian. They look like us. They may not speak in Urdu or Hindi, but, everything more or less should be very, very similar to the rest of South Asia, right? We eat rice, we eat curry, we eat dal. We're good. I think that was the mindset with which I came to Sri Lanka. And I think it was my ignorance, okay, which made me approach my time in Sri Lanka that way. And I think the very first thing I learned in Sri Lanka was Sri Lanka is South Asia, but it's not South Asian. Okay, so if someone now asks me for advice and they're moving to Sri Lanka and they happen to know South Asia, I would have to say, and this is what, by the way, for the next 5 years, this is what I ended up saying before every presentation, every strategic discussion that I had in the region about Sri Lanka. And remember, our region but perhaps you don't know, our region in South Asia for IFC is India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, because Pakistan, Afghanistan moved to this region, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. So all our regional staff, or not all, but a large chunk of our regional staff is based in India. So that is the market they know, or Bangladesh or Pakistan. And, every time we had a strategic discussion, I would say, okay, everything you know about South Asia, please leave it outside the room, then come in, and then we'll start talking about Sri Lanka. Okay. I think, that for me was probably the biggest learning and something that I carried with me forever. Sri Lanka is certainly geographically part of South Asia. We are certainly culturally part of South Asia, But I think there are huge differences in, well, our demographics. Like unlike the rest of South Asia, Sri Lanka does not have a population dividend. We have an aging population. So when you look at Sri Lanka, we look more like Japan than Bangladesh or India or Pakistan or Nepal. We don't look like that. We can't behave like that. We cannot operate like that. So that's one big difference. Then economically we're different. Geographically we're different. We are an island that is extremely diverse. While small, Sri Lanka has a diversity, whether you look at it in terms of microclimates or, the landscape. It's very different. Okay, so I think that's probably the first thing and the most important thing of my experience was, yes, Sri Lanka is South Asia, but we're not South Asian. So, with that realization, I had to learn, okay, so what exactly then are we? I can see the academic differences. I can read about, how the economy is different. I can see how the demographics are different. I can see how the literacy rates are different, all of that is there. But what's the feel? And IFC is that arm of the World Bank Group that concentrates on the private sector. Okay, so the World Bank Group has what you typically know as World Bank, which is IBRD, which concentrates on working with the public sector and the government. You then have IFC, which concentrates on working on the private sector. And then we have an entity called MIGA, which concentrates on insurance. It's a multilateral insurance agency. So for IFC, our entire role is focused around the private sector. So, okay, these are the differences academically and theoretically in the economy, in the demographics, in the economic indicators or the socioeconomic indicators. But how does that translate into what is different about the private sector? How does that affect what IFC could do? We have been in Sri Lanka for 61 years now. 61 years ago, IFC made its first investment in Sri Lanka, which was actually in textiles. Since then, we've had a very active portfolio. IFC has done some of the firsts that you don't even notice anymore as firsts. We were initial stakeholders in Dialogue. We helped set up the stock exchange. We helped set up the first asset management company. So there are many such things that IFC has done over the years. But in the more recent past, let me say in the last 10 years, somehow we were growing our program. We had an active program. We, in terms of products, just to share with those of you who may not be familiar. So sorry, let me take a step back and just kind of talk about IFC for a minute. So you have a context of how I had to operate within the IFC context and what we as an organization were looking for. So IFC we're a development finance institution. As I said, we're part of the World Bank Group. We concentrate on the private sector. And our role is to basically facilitate private sector development, okay, and see how can the private sector participate in the economic activity of a country to contribute to the development of that country. So, for example, so what do we do to achieve that? We make investments. We do direct investments where IFC writes a check for both debt and equity investments in projects. We also, what we call mobilize, which is a little different from syndication, but the same concept, I guess, where other investment partners, whether it be other multilaterals or other development finance institutions or commercial banks, are willing to come in because IFC is there as well. So we sort of mobilize and help bring them in. And then, the other sort of large product category we have is on the advisory services. where we engage with private sector and in some cases with the public sector regulators within an advisory capacity. Okay. There are very few instances where IFC works directly with the government. Advisory is one of those places where we do work directly with the public sector. And in that, what we do is we, for example, and probably the largest sort of interaction we have with the public sector is on PPPs, where we can be advising government or public sector on how to structure and competitively bid out projects where private sector participation is solicited. Okay. So broadly speaking, those are our two sort of categories, investment and advisory. IFC as a development finance institution is a bit of a split personality. We are not a bank. We are not a fund manager per se. We are not just simply a private equity investor. We will not invest in projects simply because they make money. You know, that's typically not how we approach it. That's not our mandate. That's not our role. Where we would invest would be, yes, your project is profitable, but what does it add to the economy? What does it add to the country? Okay, that's the development part of it. So you have to have commercial level returns. We are not a donor. We do not really go into subsidies. We don't try to, hand out cheaper or free money. We believe in commercial sustainability. So we'd like the project to be commercially sustainable. We'd also like it to have development returns. And then the third sort of pillar increasingly is on the environmental and social risk side. Not only must the project not do harm, it must do good, okay, on the environmental and social sort of spectrum. So that sometimes, is a difficult one to manage. How do we get all three of these things in a project? So perhaps if I can give you an example to help illustrate this. So let's say if there is a new 5-star hotel coming up in Colombo, credible, reputable sponsors, great project, it's going to make a lot of money. They would easily be able to repay a loan that they took back from IFC, and they come to IFC and say, well, we need whatever, $20 million, $30 million to build this 5-star hotel. And, these are the projections and everything looks great. Well, yes, and that's wonderful. And we're very happy to see that coming up. And yes, it will add jobs to Colombo. But does it really, is there a development angle to a new 5-star hotel in Colombo? Colombo already has 5-star hotels. What is going to be different? What's the development angle? But if someone comes to us and says, well, I want to build a 4-star hotel or a 3-star hotel or whatever, in Badula. Okay, there are no such hotels in Badula. Let's talk. It will add a whole different thing to the economy of Badula. Not only will it add jobs, there'll be a supply chain thing. There will be the local vendors and so on and so forth. So that's an entirely different proposition, okay, from a development angle. Or somebody comes and says, well, I want to build a 5-star hotel in Colombo, but I want to make it a green hotel. So it will have zero waste. It'll use green energy. It'll be a green building. Excellent. Let's talk. That's a development angle for us to hang our hat on. Something that's added to the country and the economy beyond just a profitable enterprise. Okay, so that's how we operate and that's how we look at it. So coming back to what I was explaining, we had a very active advisory program in Sri Lanka. We also had an active investment program. A large part of that investment program was focused on the financial sector, where we've traditionally been very active. And we really hadn't seen our footprint increase much beyond the financial sector. And we wanted it to. So when I came to Sri Lanka, my whole thing was, all right, if Sri Lanka is different, fine, okay. What is it that makes the private sector tick? What is different about the private sector? What do they need? How can we come in and help, meet some of those needs? How do we sort of galvanize the private sector? Let's try and understand it first. You can't offer solutions and you can't sell solutions or be part of a solution unless you understand the context. So I think, when I came in, if you had asked me, I would have said, okay, give me 6 months. I think it took a lot longer than 6 months. Okay. I think I was a bit naive and a bit probably cocky to think I could get a grip on it in 6 months. It certainly took a lot longer. But I think there are a few things that stand out in my mind when I think about what I learned during my experience in trying to learn about Sri Lanka. So some of the things that jumped out at me was the sheer wealth of talent. Okay, I think that it's hard to overestimate the number of literate, educated, really smart people that I met in Sri Lanka. Okay, at every level, I think from large-scale entrepreneurs to people who are employed in the corporate sector, to bankers, to technocrats. I think the sheer wealth of talent for me, that was certainly one of those big takeaways in my first while I was learning about Sri Lanka. I think the other thing that stood out for me in those days was the industries where Sri Lanka played in seriously, like apparel, like even tourism. We were really, really good at those. So if I go down the path of talking about apparel for just a minute, and to explain to you, Pakistan, for example, has a large textile industry. Bangladesh does fabulously. India, regionally, textiles and garments is quite a big play. Certainly in Bangladesh, it's a huge play. But Sri Lanka doesn't have those advantages. We don't have, the factors of production. We don't have a particular advantage in any one of them. Not labor, not land, not energy. Those big things, we don't have those. We can't hang our hat and we can't say, well, that's our competitive advantage. So how do these industries craft a value proposition? How do we get that competitive advantage, And I spent a lot of time talking to people trying to understand that. And over time, I realized, it is the sheer ingenuity of our entrepreneurs and our technocrats that create that competitive advantage. There is no other. Our labor is not cheap. Our energy is not cheap. Our land is not plentiful and available. We don't have that. We don't grow our own cotton. We don't have any of those inherent sort of factors of production that would make sense for us to be big players there. So how do we still hang on? How does the Sri Lankan textile or apparel industry still hang on to its edge in that industry segment? And I think, when you think of, there's that spectrum of product and service, and really it is a spectrum. I think over time, the Sri Lankan apparel industry is very slowly but very consciously moving from product to spectrum to service. Okay, they're moving across that. They are not just selling you a t-shirt. No, they're not selling you that. That's the last thing they're selling anymore. They're selling you a service. So I think, it's that ingenuity that has kept Sri Lanka at the cutting edge of this particular segment, and I hope it stays there. And again, I can give you several examples, but I'm sure all of you know those better than I do. I know I have a little bit more time, but I actually didn't want to use up all my time because I'd rather have a conversation and respond to questions. But I think a couple more things just in terms of what I take away from my experience in Sri Lanka. Right? Private sector again. I think given the wealth of talent, I find the private sector to be still fairly tentative in its approach. And that for me was a big surprise. I've had more than one conversation with businesses where they say, well, so it's okay. So what are your plans for the next 5 years, for the next, 10 years? Because those are the kind of plans that IFC could come in and help with. We're not going to provide working capital. That's not what we do. But what are you thinking of for the next 5 years? And again, more than once, the response I've heard is, well, we're waiting to see what the government does, and then we'll make our plans accordingly. And frankly, that for me was a big surprise. I've worked in very difficult markets, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Pakistan. I mean, they're all, fairly difficult markets. And you have successful businesses there. And if I go to any one of them and say, what are your plans? They will tell me, well, I have this product, I have this service, I have this is what I want to do. And what do you need from the government? And 99% of the time, they will say to us, just keep the government out of my way. If I need to build a road to this new factory, I will build it. If I need to set up my own power plant, I will set it up. Just keep the government out of our way. We'll do what we need to. Which is very different from what I heard in Sri Lanka. If you are a business and you have a viable product or service, and you say, my next 5-year plans are going to depend on, what the government does. Are we waiting for what? A trail of breadcrumbs from the government and say, okay, they're going to give me a subsidy in this, so I'll go in this. They're going to give a tax break here, so I'll go there. How does that work? You have a product, or you have a service, or you have a vision. Whatever the government gives or doesn't give, that's in addition to, that cannot be the core driver. So that again was for me something a little more difficult to understand. The fourth sort of characteristic that stayed with me was, given the level of literacy, given the level of penetration of electricity, telecom, etc., the level of digitalization of the economy was very low. And that for me was something I struggled with. Okay. It didn't fit. All the building blocks are there. Okay. All of those building blocks are there. So what was missing to bring it all together? And I have some ideas, but honestly, that's one of those things in my experience that stands out. I think, we've COVID pushed us in that direction somewhat, but very superficially. I still think that for a country like Sri Lanka, that level of digitalization is just, I don't understand, why we aren't much further ahead on it than we are. The other sort of, and maybe I will, I'll try and end on this is, I think Sri Lankan, and maybe this comes back to point 3, that Sri Lankan businesses tend to think in very short-term cycles. It's very difficult to get a Sri Lankan business to think in terms of 5 years or 10 years down the road. They think in 2 or max 3-year terms. That's how they get their funding then, and that's how the banking system works, and that's how the whole sort of ecosystem works in sort of shorter 3-year chunks. I think I've heard many different explanations for it, and I don't think there's any one explanation for why this happens. But I think one of the big factors may be just, how we're brought up. So what we experience influences what we do. And perhaps the civil conflict that lasted 30 years, during which almost all businesses grew, the economy grew. And I think the way that perhaps they did that was by managing in short-term cycles, because that was the less risky way of operating in a very high-risk environment of the civil conflict. And that perhaps is something that stuck. And now we just think in those smaller segments instead of thinking much, much longer term. So that again was something that, that was particular to Sri Lanka. And I think the last kind of thing I want to touch on is the level of innovation, that I saw in Sri Lanka. I think I saw some fabulous ideas for products or services, many of whom that, we went out and we spoke to, not necessarily because we could finance them, because they were too small and they needed different kind of incubation funds and so on and so forth. But just to understand what was going on in the market and make sure that, we were able to, if what was needed was an incubation fund, maybe IFC could come in and help, participate in that incubation fund, for example. So we kept sort of an eye, and when we tried to keep ourselves educated on this. And I think, we had our global fintech head, who's also heading our venture capital business globally. We had him come down to Sri Lanka, and he was like, Sri Lanka, really? And we were like, no. I think I canvassed internally for maybe close to a year to get him down to Sri Lanka for 2 days. And he went around and he met some of these people. And, of course, I have a very, very, narrow view, right? I'm only looking at Sri Lanka and saying, wow, we have some great ideas here. He was looking at the entire world. And he came to Sri Lanka and he said, absolutely, you have some fabulous ideas here. So if we have those fabulous ideas and we have all of those very smart people who are coming up with those good ideas, what is preventing those good ideas from becoming good businesses? And I think that skip between idea and commercialization, I think that step somehow we're missing. That again has been one of, the sort of takeaways or something that sticks with me when I think of Sri Lanka and my experience there. It's those innovative ideas. How do they get to be commercialized? What's missing? Why are we not able to do that? And then I think last of all, my experience in Sri Lanka was in every way I couldn't have asked for a more enriching 5 years. Okay. I think personally for my family and me, we met people who were so warm, so open, and so welcoming. They were very, very kind. I learned a lot, and Rohanta's one of them. I've learned a lot from him. There's so many people that I look back on as having helped me to understand and to learn about Sri Lanka, but also to, sort of make my family and me so very welcome that we feel at home. Professionally, I think, we had, it was probably one of the most difficult jobs I've done. When people used to ask me, how's Sri Lanka? And obviously people from IFC, we move everywhere and say, so how is it in Sri Lanka? And I had one sort of answer, and I gave different versions of that answer. But really, the answer was, it's an absolutely easy place to live in, a wonderful place to live in. And it's a very difficult place to work in because it's not easy to understand, the sort of the dynamics and then I think, I don't know, it's not easy to understand the industry dynamics, the personality dynamics, the cultural dynamics that go into the private sector and its and the political economy, which is really important to understand if you're trying to work in it. So I think professionally it was difficult. I think we did really well. I think, again, in my 5 years in Sri Lanka, the program grew several times. We managed to expand our footprint significantly outside of the financial services industry, where we're still, very strong, but we've achieved our sort of aim of having investments outside of that, both investments and advisory. We did key transactions. We did in several different industries. Some were small, but really impactful. We did some very large transactions, including the largest investment that IFC has made in Sri Lanka in its 61 years. We built a really strong team. I moved from Sri Lanka a few months ago, and there still isn't a new country manager, but the team is just so fantastic. They're just being able to run it on their own. A country manager is almost superfluous at this point of time. But that, again, has been something, that's been professionally really, really rewarding. So I'm going to stop there. And Rahanta, you can tell me if I overstayed my time or if we're good to move on to questions now.
Thank you very much, Amena. It was really, really interesting. And, it's very seldom that you get a outside view of Sri Lanka. I mean, we have had speakers all Sri Lankan, even the ambassadors out of Sri Lanka, like based in the UK. Then we had Dr. Kona from China, but this is the first time we had a non-Sri Lankan talking so articulately about working in Sri Lanka. And thank you very much for the very candid opinion that you gave. I really appreciate. There is a question coming in which is saying, what did you find unique working in Sri Lanka?
Okay. So, when people say things like candid, it's generally not a good thing. So I'm wondering if I overstepped or if this is, because of the guidelines you gave, I wasn't really sure what it was that you were wanting me to speak about. Nice. So I kind of went with just being fairly blunt. What was unique? I think all of those things were unique that I described. Sri Lanka's private sector and political economy they're really quite complex. Okay. Yeah. I think that was unique for me. I think the regulatory environment was unique for me. I think a country with a very, very, sort of commercial trading history and very rich heritage there. When you overlay that with a bit of a socialist hangover, I think that was unique. It creates different dynamics. And like I said, the regulatory environment in itself is really complicated. I mean, when I came in, Sri Lanka had a coalition government. They just got the coalition government. So at one point, we would be dealing with, a ministry where the minister was one party, the deputy minister was a second party, the head of the institution in that, under that ministry was a third party. The chairman of that institution was party number one again. And all of these parties were significantly different in their economic sort of outlook. I think everyone all political parties are sort of aligned in where they want to see the country, but how they want to get the country there is a very different path for each of them. And then when you have all of those views expressed in one ministry and in the institutions of that ministry, that makes for a really complicated, what exactly do we want to do here? how can IFC help? We can't even figure out within a ministry a combined view. What can IFC come in and help do that? So that was, I think, again, fairly unique. The other thing which kind of stands out is, like I said, the regulatory environment. It's quite complicated. I think in Sri Lanka, and again, I'm talking from, just a 5-year experience and just looking at it from, partially from the outside and partially from the inside. When one of our institutions or regulatory bodies or, agencies, when it doesn't seem to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, we don't shut it down. We make a new one. Okay. So, for example, we have the one-stop shop and we'll have board of investment. Okay. But then we'll say, okay, you know what? The investments are not rolling in exactly the way they should. So let me now make this other body that's going to look at investments in agriculture. Let me make this economic czar, or let me make this, and that's fine. But you didn't take away anything from the original body. So for an investor coming in, there are multiple bodies in the same industry having slightly overlapping functions. And as an investor, I have to go to each of them and navigate who needs what when. And those bodies don't talk to each other and they're not coordinated. So instead of dealing with one body, even in tourism, I'm dealing with 3 as an investor. It takes me 3 times as long. It's 3 times more expensive, probably more. And in the end, sometimes as an investor, we see people just being frustrated and leaving, because they've tried and tried and tried and tried. But the minute they peg one thing down, something changes in the other regulation. I think that's something. I don't think it's unique. I think there are bureaucracies that are, killers everywhere. But I think in Sri Lanka, in some areas, we've taken it to, it's a fine art. Let me put it that way.
Amena, the points you made comes back very, very clearly in the World Bank Competitive Index report. Yeah. So you gave it from a very practical side, but from a very research and structured way that every country gets evaluated. I see a lot of parallels in what you said. So that's very interesting. You did a lot of work with the private sector.
Right.
Any key memorable experiences you had?
I think all our work with the private sector was memorable in different ways. So we worked with John Keels. They've been a long-standing client. We've worked with them in the past in different areas. We worked with them in SAGT. We were one of the original investors in the container terminal. We've worked with them in other areas. We did a transaction with them now, which was actually a very large transaction. And like I said, the single largest investment that IFC has done in Sri Lanka. And that transaction was to partially for their tourism business. And it was done at the height of the pandemic. Okay. So you can imagine the sort of discussions that went on both with John Keels as well as internally within IFC, where we have tourism experts, for example, who look at everything. And when we went to the tourism experts and said, well, this is the investment and this is how we think that's going to play out and what the returns are going to look like. And what do you think? And then to be told, well, we have no idea because nobody knows what a post-pandemic tourism recovery will look like. We can speculate, but we really have no idea. So I think, those kind of things were really, really interesting. We had some very small transactions that were really interesting. We had so John Keels like $170 million. And then we had something along the lines of, less than $2 million in Pick Me. But again, just structuring that transaction, seeing what would make PICME grow? What is the impact? How do we get in more women drivers? How do we, for us, a ride-hailing service is a key part of the work we do on gender, because women need to have safe transport options, whether to get to work or to get to a childminder or, a caregiver or anything like that. So for us, it's a lot more than just a ride-hailing app. It's a way of making transportation safe for women. So, how that happened, how it got hit by the Easter Sunday crisis, how it got hit by the COVID crisis. And honestly, I think more than the transactions, Rohanta, I would say it was the environment, because, when COVID hit, I spent a lot of time explaining to people externally and internally within IFC to say, listen, COVID crisis for Sri Lanka is not just a COVID crisis. It is coming on the tail of the Easter Sunday crisis. We were not out of the Easter Sunday crisis. We were just starting to recover from that when COVID hit. We were just starting. I mean, if you look at numbers across anything, tourism, anything, December onwards, we were just starting to recover, and February COVID hit. So, we lived through we've been living through 3 successive crisis years. That's not easy. So I think every conversation, and even if we manage to invest $1 in these challenging times, it was a win for IFC, for the private sector, for the country. We were happy to kind of do that. We've done, Sunshine. We did a transaction with them recently. We're working with the garment industry. And that's, for us, that's not just about market creation, that's about market preservation. So maybe we wouldn't have had a role to work with, to do the same investment with an MAS or a Brandex or something 2 years ago. Probably wouldn't have had a role. What was it that we were bringing to the table that a commercial bank wasn't, right? We always have to look for our, what we call additionality. What more are we bringing than someone else's? It can just do by writing a check. But in this case, we were bringing that additionality because we were helping to preserve jobs. We were helping to preserve the market. And I think, all of those are really memorable transactions for me.
When I introduced you and I said that I have a lot of respect for you, Amena, I really meant because, from what you just now said, you chose how much of leadership that was required to a country which was just getting out of Easter attacks, and the role you played in terms of supporting organizations, big and small. You're a real friend of Sri Lanka. Any lessons you can take to Kenya from Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people in Kenya, the people I've been meeting have been asking me that as well. I think, Kenyan tourism is highly evolved, or East African tourism, let me say, is highly evolved. But I think there's still things that, Sri Lanka can teach. I think that, but let me not go into industry things. I think the level of innovation and ingenuity in Sri Lanka is certainly something I would like to, bring with me to Kenya. Absolutely. I think if there's one thing that I, it's that. I really think there's a lot to be, to be learned from Sri Lanka that way.
See, I was yesterday going through your Facebook and I saw you and the kids going in a train. I I've always noticed that, since I've also worked almost 15, 17 years in multinationals like Unilever and Reckitt, and then back in Diversity in India, when a foreigner comes, they see the country more than us. All my bosses, they have traveled all over Sri Lanka, while sometimes we have not traveled, and I saw that when I was going through your Facebook. anything memorable, I mean, on the tourism front that you think, it's Sri Lanka is so unique as an outsider?
So I did go to a lot of places in Sri Lanka. I think there's still more places that I would have liked to have gone to and I haven't. But to be honest, I'm one of those people who likes to roam around and who likes to kind of, travel. Even in Pakistan, I think I've been to a lot more places than most of the Pakistanis have. In Sri Lanka, I think just the sheer diversity of things that are available in Sri Lanka, it's hard to imagine when you look at Sri Lanka. Someone looks at a picture of the beaches and thinks, okay, we'll go to the beach, great, I'll have a beach holiday there. Someone looks at the cultural triangle and says, okay, we'll go there. But really, I think there's something in every corner of Sri Lanka. And for me, just the sheer natural beauty is probably a lot more than, is what I remember, let me say, rather than a fabulous beach hotel or, a great experience in Anuradhapura or something. I think there's, just the drives, the greenery, I think all of that has been really, really good. I guess for me, one of the places that I've enjoyed the most, and I've been there several times, was the ruins at Polonavra. I really like them. I think they're beautiful, and I think that they have an absolutely amazing, ambiance. I don't think enough people see them. I don't think we do a good enough job of presenting them, or getting people there, showing them what it is. But that's one of my nicest sort of memories of that.
What is your advice to youngsters doing an MBA? It's very tough because you have the tourism sector, which is, even after 2 years, we are not recovered. And today we had the chairman of the Tassel Tourism Hotels Association saying that things are very rough. The guys can't even survive because they're, as you very rightly said, getting out of the Easter attack, and now that's the pandemic has stuck. And then of course you have every time when the lockdowns happen, people start folding out. Sometimes drilling down and seeing how they can shed the fat in a company. And then, you have layoffs taking place. And then, of course, there's a huge appetite to study. A lot of people are studying right now, to be very honest. What is your advice to a youngster, Amena, since you have a more global view of what's happening with regard to the pandemic and how some economies are picking up, and then you again have a shutdown, So what is your advice?
So typically my advice to anyone young who's asking me for, or who's asking my opinion, is don't take anyone's advice, okay? Because for everyone, it's going to be your own journey. There's no advice, I think. My advice would be don't listen to any advice. But in terms of the general sort of economic environment, yes, tourism is going through a very rough time. Absolutely. Sri Lanka may be hit a bit worse than some other countries, but I think undoubtedly tourism around the world is suffering. Overall, economies have slowed down, but they're going to pick up again. The question is, it's not an if, it's a when. So the lockdowns and a third wave and a fourth wave and this, that, and the other, and, God forbid if we have something else, I think it's a question of when and not if. So what I would counsel, if I had to counsel anything, would be to have patience. It's not doom and gloom that's going to remain there. when things do recover, you will see pent-up demand. You will see things come back. So yes, maybe all those businesses that, shut their doors, and there were so many of them. I know the last few times when I even drove down south, so many of those places where one stopped at or stayed at or had coffee at were just shut. And it was really, really sad to see, because that meant endless number of jobs were lost. But, as things recover, some of those may come back, but in other places, new things may come back. I think for the world now, and certainly for Sri Lanka, it's not just building back, it's building better. And that's something, that IFC has embraced fully. And I really, really think that's, the way to think about it. We can't just build back to what we were. We have to build forward, and we have to build better, which means there will be jobs, there will be opportunities, there will be careers, and there will be, businesses and openings and all the other stuff that's going to come with it. But think out of the box. This is not going to be the same old box that there was, I don't think that'll be very viable, whether you're a business or you're looking at a career or anything else. You have to think out of the box a little. You have to think the world is going to build back, but it's going to build different. And you have to be part of that different. These are the people who are going to make it happen, not you and me, Rohanta. If we have to build better, we have to build different, we have to build greener, we have to build more sustainable. These are the people who are going to do it.
What made you select this career? You were in the banking sector, sure enough, but
So it's a very uninspiring story, but if you really want to hear it, I was studying in Pakistan, and there was I was a science student. And my options were I go into medicine or I go into engineering. And I was so sure I didn't want to do medicine. So I thought, okay, engineering. And then just as I was finishing my bachelor's, there was a new school for MBA that opened. So I said, why, MBA. And I went to MBA. And when I got out, I did well in my MBA. And the prize jobs in those days for, the people who topped the program were with banks. And ABN AMRO at that time was just reviving its franchise in Pakistan. So they were going from being a really small 10-person shop to, expanding their footprint across the country and that. And they came to me and said, would you like to work for us? They came to me before I graduated, and I said, sure. And that's it. And I went to banking, and I realized I liked it. And it was, not that I like every aspect of it, not like it's a job, right? At the end of the day, it's a job. It's even being a rocket scientist can be boring and dull and, a drag sometimes. But I found it fit me, and I fit it. So I've stayed in it.
Any views on women empowerment which you championed in Sri Lanka? What are your thoughts on that?
So in Sri Lanka, Rohanta knows as well, IFC had its largest single country gender program in Sri Lanka. And it was a source of great surprise to a lot of people in IFC, like, why Sri Lanka? Why do we need such a broad gender program in Sri Lanka? And really, it takes some explaining, internally and externally to do that. I remember when we were designing the program, and we went to a minister at one of the ministries that was involved with women's economic empowerment. And we were trying to explain, well, this is what we'd like to do. We were not asking for money. We were not asking for anything else. We had the money. We had the expertise. We were just asking for support, that if we come back and, say, okay, our study showed this, would you at least be willing to listen? Would you be willing to support? And I remember the minister said, I don't think we need this in Sri Lanka. And I was like, okay? But, women's participation in the workforce is half that of men, and, yet they're equally educated, they're equally literate, life expectancy is that long. And he said to me, no, we really don't need that. And there was a senior bureaucrat sitting there. He said, yes, look, call, our a mid-level bureaucrat who happened to be a woman, said, look, call her, ask her. She has 2 SIM cards. She has 2 phones. Even her maid will have a phone. We're not like Pakistan. We are very empowered. We don't need a gender program, So it took a lot of explaining to say that, women's economic empowerment is more than just us being able to buy cell phones and, have a Facebook account or whatever. I think, like I said, the number of inspirational and talented people I've seen in Sri Lanka, it's hard to explain how many of those are women. Okay. I think, both in the civil service as well as outside of the civil service, in the private sector, in the financial sector, there are so many talented women. And I think that whole economic empowerment of women conversation has to be held repeatedly and, like a broken record, because there are things that clearly we are not doing. If only 50% of our females are in the workforce or are contributing to economic development, they don't have to be employed. They can be doing their own business. And this issue becomes even more important for a country like Sri Lanka. When we are a services-driven economy, we have an aging population, which means our workforce is declining, and we're a service economy. How can we grow? You cannot match those things. The only way we can grow is if we can get the rest of our workforce, the women who are not participating, to come in and join that, right? So for Sri Lanka, the gender conversation, it's not just a gender conversation, it's an economic conversation. We cannot have economic growth in a services-driven economy unless we're able to marshal more resources. And those resources are the women who are right now not part of our, who are not contributing actively.
If you're given another post in Sri Lanka, would you come, Amena?
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't need to think about it.
What is your reading of the SME sector of Sri Lanka, which is about 73% of Sri Lanka's economy?
Right. Severely underperforming, severely under-leveraged in every which way. I think, access to finance is a big issue for them. I think the regulatory environment is a huge issue for them. If you think of a small operator in, pick a thing, tourism, just to make it easy and continue with the examples we've been discussing. If a guy has a small hotel or a bed and breakfast kind of place anywhere, somewhere near Yala, what happens? Do you know how many permits he needs to get? Do you know where the permits he needs to get are from? He's the cook, or his wife is the cook. He's the receptionist. He's the manager. He's the accountant. And he needs to get 5 permits that are only going to come from Colombo. And that's just 5 from Colombo. We did a survey in, was it Mannar? I can't remember exactly where we did the survey to see. And I think, at that time we'd counted, there were 19 different permits and registrations that little, hotel operator needed to get. All 19 of them were not from one place. So he would have to go to Colombo, sit there for 3 days, 5 days, 6 days. Who's going to run his thing? So he doesn't want to grow. He wants to stay at that place where he can be under the radar and that. Because the complexity of growing from that S to an M and beyond is too much for him. And I think you can see that. We have a huge, in every industry you pick up, this is one of those characteristics of Sri Lanka. You have the very large companies, then you have nothing. And then you have the very small companies. Okay, so why aren't those very small companies? In some cases, they've been in existence for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Why aren't they growing to that missing middle? You know, I think that's the opportunity and the tragedy of the SME space there. And access to capital is certainly one constraint, but I don't think it's the only constraint.
So, you like wildlife, Amena?
I do.
So,
I can't say I enjoy it from a novice point of view. Yes, absolutely.
you will see a lot of wildlife in that part of the world, and I think it's the best, I think, that I have seen actually. I mean, you have the north part of Kenya, which is, I think, Samburu, and then you have the Mara. It's really, really beautiful. Last question coming out. What is any key advice to young Amena, who is 20 years old?
Young Amena, who's 20 years old. Okay, that's too far back. I think just keep putting one foot in front of the other. You know, they're going to be difficult days. They're going to be difficult months. There might even be difficult years. And it doesn't matter. You know, there's not much that you can do to make it easier, but you have to get through them. So I think one foot in front of the other.
Thank you very much, Amena, for spending time. And Sri Lanka, we really miss you. And when you do have free time, please come over. We've got a lot of friends in Sri Lanka. And we wish you all the very best in Kenya. And believe me, once the pandemic over, definitely some of us will come over and pay you a visit. So thank you very much again. And can I hand over to Kaushali? Kaushali.
My pleasure to be here. And Rohanta, you and all my friends are very welcome. And of course, I'll be back in Sri Lanka soon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amena.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor. And thanks a lot, Amena, for sharing those wonderful thoughts and moreover, sharing that wonderful experience of all these tiny, tiny odds, which will be very supportive to all our students, especially as they are embarking in their new journeys, just like we all did. So thanks a lot for that sharing. And that brings us to another end of another session. And if there's any questions, please do write to us. Students, you can, of course, have a connection and a network with all these guests who are coming on board with us. And we hope that we will have an opportunity in the near future to see Amena physically in our university and to have that conversation continued with our postgraduate students, of course, and along with the other student body as well. So while we are ending up the session, have a safe week, and we will see you back again in another week's time. Until then, good night.
Thanks, Amena. Thank you.